This Soldier Island now, he'd be interested to see it. A lot of gossip flying about. Looked as though there might be something in the rumor that the Admiralty or the War Office or the Air Force had got hold of it. Young Elmer Robson, the American millionaire, had actually built the place. Spent thousands on it, so it was said. Every mortal luxury. Exeter. And an hour to wait. And he didn't want to wait. He wanted to get on. Dr. Armstrong was driving his Morris across Salisbury Plain. He was very tired. Success had its penalties. There had been a time when he had sat in his consulting room in Harley Street, correctly appareled, surrounded with the most up-to-date appliances and the most luxurious furnishings, and waited through the empty days for his venture to succeed or fail. Well, it had succeeded. He'd been lucky. Lucky and skillful, of course. He was a good man at his job. But that wasn't enough for success. You had to have luck as well. And he'd had it. An accurate diagnosis, a couple of grateful women, patients, women with money and position and word had got about. You ought to try Armstrong, quite a young man, but so clever. Pam had been to all sorts of people for years, and he put his finger on the trouble at once. The ball had started rolling, and now Dr. Armstrong had definitely arrived. His days were full. He had little leisure. And so, on this August morning, he was glad that he was leaving London and going to be for some days on an island off the Devon coast. Not that it was exactly a holiday. The letter he had received had been rather vague in its terms, but there was nothing vague about the accompanying check. A whacking fee. These Owens must be rolling in money. Some little difficulty, it seemed. A husband who was worried about his wife's health and wanted a report on it without her being alarmed. She wouldn't hear of seeing a doctor. Her nerves. Nerves! The doctor's eyebrows went up. These women and their nerves. Well, it was good for business after all. Half the women who consulted him had nothing the matter with them but boredom, but they wouldn't thank you for telling them so. And one could usually find something. A slightly uncommon condition of the some long word. Nothing at all serious, but it needs just putting right. A simple treatment. Well, medicine was mostly faith healing when it came to it, and he had a good manner. He could inspire hope and belief. Lucky that he'd managed to pull himself together.
In time after that business, 15 years ago, it had been a near thing that he'd been going to pieces. The shock had pulled him together. He'd cut out drink altogether. By Jove, it had been a near thing, though. With a devastating, ear-splitting blast on the horn, an enormous supersports Dalmain car rushed past him at 80 miles an hour. Dr. Armstrong nearly went into the hedge. One of these young fools who tore round the country. He hated them. That had been a near shave too. Damned young fool. Tony Marston, roaring down into Mere, thought to himself, the amount of cars crawling about the roads is frightful. Always something blocking your way, and they will drive in the middle of the road. Pretty hopeless driving in England anyway. Not like France where you really could let out. Should he stop here for a drink, or push on? Heaps of time. Only another 100 miles, and a bit to go. He'd have a gin and ginger beer. Fizzing hot day. This island place ought to be rather good fun, if the weather lasted. Who were these Owens, he wondered. Rich and stinking, probably. Badger was rather good at nosing people like that out. Of course he had to, poor old chap, with no money of his own. Hoped they'd do one well in drinks. Never knew with these fellows who'd made their money and weren't born to it. Pity that story about Gabriel Turl having bought Soldier Island wasn't true. He'd like to have been in with that film star crowd. Oh well, he supposed there'd be a few girls there. Coming out of the hotel, he stretched himself, yawned, looked up at the blue sky, and climbed into the Dalmain. Several young women looked at him admiringly. His 6 feet of well-proportioned body, his crisp hair, tanned face, and intensely blue eyes. He let in the clutch with a roar and leapt up the narrow street. Old men and errand boys jumped for safety. The latter looked after the car admiringly. Anthony Marston proceeded on his triumphal progress. Mr. Blore was in the slow train from Plymouth. There was only one other person in his carriage, an elderly seafaring gentleman with a bleary eye. At the present moment he had dropped off to sleep. Mr. Blore was writing carefully in a little notebook.
That's the lot, he muttered to himself. Emily Brent, Vera Claythorne, Dr. Armstrong, Anthony Marston, Old Justice Wargrave, Philip Lombard, General MacArthur, CMG, DSO, manservant and wife, Mr. and Mrs. Rogers. He closed the notebook and put it back in his pocket. He glanced over at the corner and the slumbering man. Had one over the 8, diagnosed Mr. Blore accurately. He went over things carefully and conscientiously in his mind. Job ought to be easy enough, he ruminated. Don't see how I can slip up on it. Hope I look all right. He stood up and scrutinized himself anxiously in the glass. The face reflected there was of a slightly military cast with a mustache. There was very little expression in it. The eyes were gray and set rather close together. Might be a major, said Mr. Blore. No, I forgot. There's that old military gent. He'd spot me at once. South Africa, said Mr. Blore. That's my line. None of these people have anything to do with South Africa, and I've just been reading that travel folder so I can talk about it all right. Fortunately, there were all sorts and types of colonials. As a man of means from South Africa, Mr. Blore felt that he could enter into any society unchallenged. Soldier Island. He remembered Soldier Island as a boy. Smelly sort of rock covered with gulls. Stood about a mile from the coast. Funny idea to go and build a house on it. Awful in bad weather. But millionaires were full of whims. The old man in the corner woke up and said, "You can't never tell at sea never." Mr. Blore said soothingly, "That's right, you can't." The old man hiccuped twice and said plaintively, "There's a squall coming." Mr. Blore said, "No, no, mate, it's a lovely day." The old man said angrily, "There's a squall ahead. I can smell it." "Maybe you're right," said Mr. Blore pacifically. The train stopped at a station and the old fellow rose unsteadily. "This where I get out." He fumbled with the window. Mr. Blore helped him. The old man stood in the doorway. He raised a solemn hand and blinked his bleary eyes. "Watch and pray," he said. "Watch and pray. The day of judgment is at hand." He collapsed through the doorway onto the platform. From a recumbent position, he looked up at Mr. Blore and said with immense dignity,
"I'm talking to you, young man. The day of judgment is very close at hand." Subsiding onto his seat, Mr. Blore thought to himself, "He's nearer the day of judgment than I am." But there, as it happens, he was wrong. Chapter 2. Outside Oakbridge Station, a little group of people stood in momentary uncertainty. Behind them stood porters with suitcases. One of these called, "Jim." The driver of one of the taxis stepped forward. "You for Soldier Island, maybe?" he asked in a soft Devon voice. 4 voices gave assent, and then immediately afterwards gave quick surreptitious glances at each other. The driver said, addressing his remarks to Mr. Justice Wargrave as the senior member of the party, "There are 2 taxis here, sir. One of them must wait till the slow train from Exeter gets in, a matter of 5 minutes. There's one gentleman coming by that. Perhaps one of you wouldn't mind waiting. You'd be more comfortable that way." Vera Claythorne, her own secretarial position clear in her mind, spoke at once. "I'll wait," she said, "if you will go on." She looked at the other 3. Her glance and voice had that slight suggestion of command in it that comes from having occupied a position of authority. She might have been directing which tennis sets the girls were to play in. Miss Brent said stiffly, "Thank you," bent her head, and entered one of the taxis, the door of which the driver was holding open. Mr. Justice Wargrave followed her. Captain Lombard said, "I'll wait with Miss Claythorne," said Vera. "My name is Lombard, Philip Lombard." The porters were piling luggage on the taxi. Inside, Mr. Justice Wargrave said, with due legal caution, "Beautiful weather we are having." Miss Brent said, "Yes, indeed." A very distinguished old gentleman, she thought to herself. Quite unlike the usual type of man in seaside guest houses. Evidently, Mrs. or Miss Oliver had good connections. Mr. Justice Wargrave inquired, Do you know this part of the world well? I have been to Cornwall and to Torquay, but this is my first visit to this part of Devon. The judge said,
I also am unacquainted with this part of the world. The taxi drove off. The driver of the second taxi said, Like to sit inside while you're waiting? Vera said decisively, Not at all. Captain Lombard smiled. He said, That sunny wall looks more attractive. Unless you'd rather go inside the station? No, indeed. It's so delightful to get out of that stuffy train. He answered, Yes. Traveling by train is rather trying in this weather. Vera said conventionally, I do hope it lasts. The weather, I mean. Our English summers are so treacherous. With a slight lack of originality, Lombard asked, Do you know this part of the world well? No, I've never been here before. She added quickly, conscientiously determined to make her position clear at once. I haven't even seen my employer yet. Your employer? Yes. I'm Mrs. Owen's secretary. Oh, I see. Just imperceptibly, his manner changed. It was slightly more assured, easier in tone. He said, Isn't that rather unusual? Vera laughed. Agatha Christie. Oh, no, I don't think so. Her own secretary was suddenly taken ill, and she wired to an agency for a substitute, and they sent me. So that was it. And suppose you don't like the post when you've got there. Vera laughed again. Oh, it's only temporary, a holiday post. I've got a permanent job at a girls' school. As a matter of fact, I'm frightfully thrilled at the prospect of seeing Soldier Island. There's been such a lot about it in the papers. Is it really very fascinating? Lombard said, I don't know. I haven't seen it. Oh, really? The Owens are frightfully keen on it, I suppose. What are they like? Do tell me. Lombard thought. Awkward. I suppose to have met them or not. He said quickly, There's a wasp crawling up your arm. No, keep quite still. He made a convincing pounce. There. It's gone. Oh, thank you. There are a lot of wasps about this summer. Yes. I suppose it's the heat. Who are we waiting for, do you know? I haven't the least idea. The loud, drawn-out scream of an approaching train was heard. Lombard said, That will be the train now.